to collect some data and go, okay, I'm good here. I want to try this intervention. And I want to be clear that intervention is just a continuation of assessment, because until we intervene successfully, we haven't verified our hypothesis. So again, a hypothesis is our best guess under a particular circumstance. But until you actually do something to try to change the behavior, it's just a guess. Presumably it's a well-informed guess, but it's just a guess ultimately. Next slide, Dave. Now, I want to give you a way of thinking about behavior. Most of the time when we start talking about behavior, we just talk about the behavior, what the child is doing. The trick of the functional assessment is to try to understand the function or the motivation for the behavior. Why would that student be engaging in this behavior at this time? And we'll give you a very, very simple example that probably every one of you have done. How many of you have ever used leaving the classroom, going to the bathroom as an excuse to get out of class? And I would suspect that on some occasions, all of you have done that. Now, the question I would ask you is, why in the world would you choose to go to a public school bathroom to get out of class? Just how bad does the classroom have to be to make that bathroom the more attractive option? But it may tell you that there's something in that. If a student's regularly doing that, it may tell you something that is going on in the classroom that is so unpleasant for the student that being in the public restroom is actually a better option. I've never found exactly what that would be, but but some of our students routinely choose to do that. Next slide, Dave. Now, behavior always occurs in some kind of context. You're more likely to see students want to leave the classroom when the context is doing hard work that's hard for that student. It may be math. For some students, it may be writing. It may be that the activity's gone on too long and the student just needs a change. But that context helps us understand why that function or that motivation of behavior is important to a student. So we can arrange environments where the work is easy. The student chooses to stay in the classroom. We give the student hard work. The student may more likely choose to leave. So we can never understand behavior completely without also understanding the context in which it occurs. Next slide, Dave. So here's the basic logic of functional analysis. Behavior occurs for a reason. That's the why that we're trying to understand. If we understand why it's occurring, then sometimes we can develop very simple, straightforward interventions to address that. I was once asked to come and assess a young man with Down syndrome who was throwing very serious tantrums and destroying the classroom. Well, it turned out the only time he was actually doing that was when he was being required to go to a center that required writing. The pencils that they had to write with were the typical #2 Ticonderoga pencil. But his fine motor skills were such that there was no way he could effectively grip that pencil and write. So the function of his behavior was to get out of writing assignments. Our intervention was to buy one of those rubber things that accountants use to put on a pencil that allowed it to be a fat pencil. And now he could write, and we eliminated tantruming during writing activities. So the intervention cost 29 cents basically, which was a very simple solution to what had been a very serious problem. So we have essentially two strategies that we can use to help us improve behavior. One is we can make the problem behavior irrelevant by rearranging the environment so that we're not tapping into motivation that's influencing the student's behavior. So we can make the work easier, we can make the task shorter, we can have more variety, more rapid changes. Any of those things would count as making the problem behavior irrelevant, because the student simply doesn't have to misbehave in order to accomplish the function. We can enrich the environment with just more positive attention for students. Our second option is to teach a student a more appropriate way to accomplish the same function. If they want to get out of class, instead of throwing furniture, maybe they just say, I need to get out of here for a while, use their words, so to speak. Now, most of the time, early in interventions, we're going to need to do both of these things. Arrange the environment so that we reduce the motivation to misbehave while we're teaching more appropriate ways to accomplish the function. Next slide, Dave. And I just want to end by talking about functions of behavior. Katie and Christine are going to talk about them in more detail. But broadly speaking, students engage in behavior either to gain something, attention or whatever, or they engage in behavior to escape unpleasant circumstances. So as you're looking at behavior, you can always ask yourself, what's the student trying to gain, and what's the student trying to escape by engaging in this particular problem behavior. All right, thank you for your attention, and I don't remember who's next. I'll let Dave be the host.
Okay, thank you, Ronnie. And now I'll give turn the time over to Christine.
Hi guys, I've seen a few names pop up of friends of mine around the Valley, so welcome. I'm glad you guys are here. Dave, if you'll advance to the next slide, please. I'm going to tack on to what Ronnie was talking about and talk a little bit about a couple of the functions of behavior, and then also the approach that we take when we implement an intervention. So like Ronnie mentioned, it's important that we eliminate or make the problem behavior irrelevant. And not only that, but in addition to that, you can't just remove the problem and take something away from a student. You need to replace that with something else, which is the replacement behavior, which is a new skill. And we're doing those things simultaneously. We're teaching the new skill at that same time, and that skill will take the place of that problem behavior. This is important when we talk about function of behavior, that we understand why a student is doing what they are, so that we can help them to fill that gap of the problem behavior with the appropriate functionally matched replacement behavior. I think we think about teaching, and I know when I was a teacher, I didn't think about teaching behavior. I just figured that kids already came to school with those things already learned. And, you know, just like teaching somebody how to read, we spend a lot of time teaching what the letter A is and what the letter A sounds like, and that it has multiple sounds and multiple different places in the word. And that if you have an E on the end of a word, that changes the sound of the A. We learn the letter A and where it is in words probably thousands of times. We're repeatedly exposed to teaching the letter A and us being able to learn it. And you think about our students at school, how much time do we spend teaching behaviors? We want them to sit down, raise their hand. And I think we think that telling is teaching, and they're two different things, right? And so teaching a student behaviors that we want to see in the classroom and behaviors that are appropriate, it takes time and it takes repetition. Some of our students will need ongoing support, maybe forever, while they're in the school system, and that can look different depending on their needs. As we talk about MTSS, or multi-tiered systems of support in schools, a lot of times a teacher's brain will automatically go to the academic pieces and what that means, but that also goes into our behavior plans and making sure that we have a multi-tiered system of support, Tier 1 interventions, as well as Tier 2 and Tier 3 as a student needs those, and what those things are and what those needs are. Dave, will you advance the slide, please? So as Ronnie said, there are two broad functions of behavior: to escape something or to gain something, access to something. So this is just breaking it down further. And as I said earlier, we kind of hypothesize the function because sometimes there are multiple functions or different functions for different settings. And most of the time it's not just one reason across the different settings the student has. As Ronnie mentioned earlier, one of the functions is to escape or avoid something unpleasant. You know, school is very, very difficult for a lot of our kids. Just getting up and the physical act of getting to school with all of the difficulties they may have, you know, in the morning at home and in carpool and things like that may cause some uncomfort even before they get there. Another function would be to get attention, and that would be from peers or adults, and that would be getting attention in an appropriate way, good attention, or getting attention in an inappropriate way from adults and peers. Another function is to gain access to a desired tangible item or activity. A lot of times our kids want to play games, have activities or things like that in the classroom, or they want access to certain items in the classroom, and they may have behaviors that are maybe sometimes not so great to get access to those things. And then what I'm not going to spend too much time on is sensory stimulation. Some of our kids have a real need for stimulation that the function of that is to provide themselves with some comfort. And so that is something that's a little bit different than some of the others, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about gaining attention or gaining access to a tangible item or activity. Next, please. So like Ronnie mentioned earlier, we need to know why a student is behaving the way they are so that we can support them in fulfilling that need with a better behavior, a more appropriate behavior, teaching them a different behavior. So we will be putting interventions in place that do two things. We're going to be eliminating the behavior and replacing that behavior with new skills, teaching them how to get the things that they need in an appropriate fashion. So just kind of reiterating that multi-pronged approach. Next, please. So the function of gaining attention can be complex. And I didn't used to think it was so much of an issue, but the more I work with some of our students, even currently, it's surprising at how complex that can be, what type of attention and from who. So I broke this down, and I don't mean to confuse anybody, but I was trying to break it down into different reasons that a student, you know, different functions. So they can be pure attention for appropriate behavior, pure attention for inappropriate behavior, adult attention for appropriate, and adult attention for inappropriate attention and behavior. So the function of behavior, especially when it includes peers, because a lot of times we can control sometimes the reaction that an adult will give a student for appropriate or inappropriate behaviors, but it's much more difficult to figure out how to help with the pure attention, especially if the student is engaging in inappropriate behaviors and receiving attention from their peers for that problem behavior. So like I said, it can be a combination of any or all of those in the above categories, and it may be different across settings or across staff. And so attention can be pretty complex. Next, Dave. So when we implement a function-matched intervention, we take what we know about the student and we hypothesize what we think the function is. If we think it's attention, we'll kind of put together the best hypothesis of variables together and figure out what a function-matched intervention could be. Like I said earlier, to make the problem irrelevant, like Ronnie says, and to teach new skills, to teach skills that teach the student how to get what they need. Two really easy and quick interventions that I always suggest, no matter what age of student I'm working with, and no matter what really their their problem behaviors are is two really great ways to get student compliance. One of them is to engage in a positive student-teacher relationship. And a lot of times that will alleviate many of the problems that we see. And I know sometimes it's hard to engage in a positive relationship when you have kids that are so difficult, but a lot of times that is half the battle. Is just them knowing that you're there, that you like them, that you're there to support them, you're there to help them get started on an assignment, and that you want them to be successful. John Hattie does research on effect sizes for all kinds of interventions, and I'm not positive, this may not be correct, but I think the student-teacher relationship was like 0.72 or something. It had a very high effect size for interventions that were successful. And the other one is praise. And all people, I think most people, want to be acknowledged for their efforts and appreciated for their efforts. And to tell a student that you're proud of them for being on time coming to class can go a long, long way. That was an intervention we put in place for a high school student who was chronically late to class. All I did is ask his teacher to engage in a positive relationship with the student and praise him when he was there, because he wasn't on time, so we couldn't praise that yet, but just that they were glad that he was there. They were glad to see him. They appreciated him being there. And with that small tweak, that student began to be on time. And then the teacher was able to praise him being on time. And after we started that, the teacher eventually faded out that level of praise, kept the relationship going and working on that. That student was never late again. And this is a student who had chronic absenteeism and tardies over months. And one simple tweak for that teacher made the difference between him being in class and being successful and not. And so we didn't have to employ any other interventions for him to get him there and to help him be successful. So it goes a long, long way. And in my experience, this is not research-based or anything else, but I think those two things in combination will get at about 70 to 75% of your problem right there. And then having somebody that can come in and help with the interventions and making sure that they match the needs is the other part of the way. If we fail to match the interventions to the function of the behavior, we may have better outcomes with a student, but they won't last long. So if we are putting an intervention in place where we're giving a student stickers, but she wants attention, then the stickers may work for a couple of days or maybe even a couple of weeks, but eventually that behavior is going to go back to what it was because we weren't matching the intervention to the function, which was attention. She didn't want a tangible sticker, she wanted teacher attention. So it's really important that we match those functions to the interventions. Next slide, Dave. And the same thing with tangibles and activities. We're just trying to implement an intervention that's going to be successful by matching it to the function. So in this case, the function would be access to a tangible or activity. We would put specific interventions in place to help a student learn how to gain access to those things in an appropriate way, and simultaneously making that problem behavior irrelevant. And I think the next slide, we're ready. And I think that's all for my part. So I'm glad to work with the group. I'm honored to be part of this group. There's a lot of really great experience here, and I hope to work with you. That some of the names I saw pop up, and I hope you guys reach out and contact us so I can work with you further. So thank you.
Thank you, Christine. And again, great to have you as part of this team. Katie, thanks for sharing some information with our participants tonight.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. So I get to address escape, and I'll say the same thing. I'm so excited to be a part of this team. Of all the roles I have had in my career, my absolute favorite is working boots to the ground with students and training teachers and supporting teachers. So this is the perfect combination of those things. And so, yeah, what you've heard about the functions that maintain behavior, and, you know, over the years, we've had some questions about, does every behavior really fall into, is maintained by one of those functions? And I can safely say yes, they all fall into one of these categories. They might be maintained by multiple things, attention and escape combination, but they definitely do fall into one of these. And so I'll be addressing escape. And let me just also say that, I realize as a teacher, it's really hard to entertain the idea of allowing a child to escape or a young adult to escape from a task that we have, provided. And as teachers, we have so many things we're juggling. We have all these IEP goals or all these areas of content, all these skills we are in charge of. And, to have a student say, I want to walk away from this for a while, sometimes kind of, rubs us the wrong way. But what we need to realize is that student is going to access escape whether we like it or not, right? And so to put a very consistent, systematic way of allowing them to access that escape is much better in the long run for everyone involved. And as adults, we make a lot of choices in our own lives to escape certain things. I can walk away from something I don't like. I can cancel plans if I don't want to participate. I can switch to a different task and then go back to my original task. Often our students don't have that flexibility or permission to do those things. And so when they engage in challenging behavior, then all of a sudden we go, uh-oh, we have a problem. So I think that's good to recognize that, we need to respect their wants and needs as well. So escape basically is defined as avoiding or delaying or actually being removed or escaping from some aversive or non-preferred activity, right? We can avoid a certain activity we don't like it was mentioned, maybe it's a math worksheet, maybe it's a writing task, maybe it's reading because I struggle with reading and I don't find it reinforcing. So I want to get away from that area of content. We can avoid people, certain, adults in our environment or certain peers that maybe, we just don't find to be highly reinforcing. We can avoid, certain contexts or environments. Something might be too loud, too warm, too difficult, too unfamiliar, or too structured or too unstructured. It just depends. So basically, we're defining escape as any non-preferred activity or situation, something a student does not like, right? Okay, next slide, Dave. And, some of this was mentioned previously, but school is a demand-heavy environment, right? And students come to us kind of with their tote bag of what has worked for them previously. And often they are very strong escape-motivated behaviors, right? And so they have this repertoire of behaviors that they demonstrate. And so we need to, as Ronnie said, and as Christine said, make that irrelevant, right? We need to reduce the motivation to engage in those behaviors. But often we make the mistake as educators of accidentally reinforcing those escape-motivated behaviors with minor things like negotiating or, representing the instructions over and over for a student who might be off task for a bit. Removing the student from the environment. You know what? It's like you're engaging in this challenging behavior. I need you out right now just because you are really disrupting my classroom. So any of those things, offering alternatives. Oh, you don't want to do this? How about this one? And often that can be a positive thing. That can work for a student, but often that can reinforce the escape motivated behavior as well. So we just have to be careful because some of those things, and this goes back to Ronnie's, discussion of a functional assessment. We need to figure out why this student is engaging in these behaviors. And if it is to access escape, then we need to systematically and consistently put in a socially acceptable way of them accessing that same function. And so, we can do that through teaching them to take a break, teaching them to walk away from that task for a little bit, teaching them to do, only part of the task. We have methods like curricular revision, looking at, how to make them more successful in that task, fading some of the demand, there are a variety of methods and interventions we could put into place. So next slide, Dave, please. All right. And we, Christine mentioned this too, but we really have to match that function in order to sustain this appropriate behavior, because otherwise that student will continue to demonstrate the challenging behavior. And there has been research done that even if a student puts about 2 seconds in between, the instruction being given and actually engaging in what they were supposed to do, that 2 seconds can serve as reinforcing that escape behavior. So I rip a paper, my teacher has to go get me another one, another one for me. That in itself is reinforcing enough. I fall to the floor and then get back in my desk. That is reinforcing enough. So all these, inappropriate or challenging behaviors, we have to, again, make those irrelevant, reduce the motivation to demonstrate those, and give them a viable, socially appropriate way to access that same function. Okay. And I think that is it for me, Dave. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Well, thank you, Katie, Christine, and Ronnie, and for the information that you've shared. I do want to just comment on a few things. What we do understand about the science of behavior is that it is lawful, meaning that it seems to bend oftentimes in terms of the laws that we've discussed tonight, which is students are working to satisfy their needs in the ways that have been described. If you look at behavior from an evolutionary standpoint, students are simply trying to survive in the settings that they are being educated in. And if they have behaviors that are unusual, then you have to look at them from the standpoint of why would that behavior be necessary or useful in this setting to this student, and to get to the bottom of that. And so I hope that you've enjoyed the information that we've shared tonight. I do want to invite you again to, in the chat window, if you want to get a informational packet about our services, just type in your name, your organization name, and your email address, and I will be sending out an informational packet that you can use to facilitate a site-based conversation about how BSCT services may address your needs. So we do have a little bit of time left, and for anyone that wants to stay longer, we have time for questions. And so if you want to type a question into the chat box that we can respond to and take on, we would be willing to do that. I do want to note that each student is so interestingly individual in their needs that we couldn't possibly answer ethically a question about a specific student necessarily. But if you have some general questions about why students engage in the behaviors that they do, we'd like to address them now. And if you have questions about our services, that would be fine too. So I'm watching for questions that come in, everyone, on the chat screen. Thanks everyone for sharing your email addresses. We'll love to send that information out to you. Anybody out there with some questions? I'm sure that there must be some.
Awesome.
Dave, I just wondered, in that packet that you send people that have put their emails in, if I can send a couple of links for the research on the 2 interventions that I mentioned.
Sure.
They'll email those to you tonight, and then you can send them out to people who are on here.
You bet. So I'm watching for some questions. We certainly can do that. While I'm waiting, I just want to comment on what Christine said about praise. Years ago when I was a kid, I wanted badly one of those little Pez dispensers. And my mother couldn't afford to buy me one. When she finally could buy me one, what I came to know as I tipped back the little head and get the candy out, that the Pez dispenser was much cooler than the Pez candy itself. And what I came to think about later on is that we are dispensers of reinforcement as we interact with students and with adults. And if we find out that don't happen to be a very cool Pez dispenser or dispenser of reinforcement, we have to take a look at ourselves and see, how do we make ourselves a more engaging, more reinforcing to others, so that when we give our attention to kids for their pro-social behavior, that it really sticks, reinforces that behavior, and that we're more apt to see it. Oh, here's a question right here. What are some tips for reducing motivation for behavior when it relates to lagging skills? I mean, assuming lagging meaning that a task is offered and the kid takes a long time to get started. Katie, Lonnie, and Christine, anybody want to take that on?
Well, is she talking about the lagging skills like in the collaborative problem solving model? Is that like
Or
Ross
just-
Green's model?
Oh, just curriculum in general. I've tried, like, for kiddos who move like molasses, I've tried a beat the timer system too. I don't know if, some kind of motivation like that. But I'd also, wonder, is it skill based? I mean, is there a deficit there? Can they really do the task, or is there a reason by lagging skills? Okay. So I guess I'm not understanding well below grade level, but reducing motivation for behavior. So is the intent that they're engaging in all this challenging behavior because they can't keep up with the curriculum, so they're not being successful? Okay. Yeah, Diane, that sounds like it would, Christine and Ronnie, jump in if you want, and Dave too. But it sounds like there would have to be kind of a whole curricular assessment and really maybe breaking things down in small chunks. A lot of just, tiny bits of demand, and then heavy reinforcement for doing, you want them to contact reinforcement and feel like they're successful. And then a little bit at a time, start strengthening those skills, because they're already in a situation where they're probably not feeling very successful.
Katie, I would offer too that lagging, when you think about what your kid does, if you can put yourself in that situation, say, why do I lag? When a task is given to me, why is it that I'm lagging in terms of my action?
Yeah.
It can be too heavy a task. It can be an undesirable task. So lagging can be very reinforcing, because I don't actually have to engage in that work at that point. And so that's one thing that I thought of. But the other thing that I wondered about is that what reinforcement is available for not lagging? If you get your work done, you start quickly and you get it done quickly, why would that be reinforcing? And how could you use that reinforcement to get them to engage quickly?
But I think she said there that this child is way below grade level. So they're lagging in the academic, they're not academically successful because they're so behind.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is certainly you're going to have to do some level of curricular modification so that we're not teaching at the student's frustration level, but teaching at their instructional level. And a lot of times what you have to do to start, because the kids have had so many failure experiences prior to now, is I actually start behind. I introduce tasks at their mastery level so that they build up success. And I do two things. One, that reduces the motivation to misbehave because they're now able to actually do the task. And I also increase the reinforcement for completing tasks. And there's any number of ways to do that. But if they complete the task, they score points, or they get 3 minutes of free time or whatever. But some way of getting them to contact consequences for actually being successful in completing work. Some of these kids are so far behind, they've never experienced completing work in a particular area. And I've done things like ask the kid, look at this worksheet, commit to how many problems you think you can do. If they're really resistant to working because of skill deficits, I ask them, how many problems do you think you can get done? And they say, I'm going to do 3, and they do 3, there's reinforcement. And over time, you raise the ceiling, the floor, so that they have to commit to 5, then 10, or whatever. But it's a way to reinforce task completion and letting the child have some control over it. And I never experienced a child saying, I'm not going to do any, if I've arranged the instruction to be at an appropriate instructional level. And again, if you start at mastery level and then make the work slightly harder, you can actually move them through pretty quickly. The thing we have to remember is while they're catching up to their skills, we're going to have to continue to make curricular modifications. They're not going to learn to read at grade level overnight. So how do we support them during that? And one way is to make the work easier at their appropriate instructional level. And the other is to actually reinforce being engaged with the task. And that's my short answer.
Let me thank you, Ronnie, and let's take on another question here. How do you, this is from Trudy Seeley, how do you help students to stop incessant talking no matter where they're sat or seated?
Mm-hmm. I would want to know what they're talking about. I mean, are they engaging peers, and then are they getting the peer attention? Is it like muttering to themselves? I mean, that behavior can take on kind of a lot of different, functions, and it can look very different. So if it's engaging peers, that would be a different kind of intervention, where maybe we get peer buy-in to say, you know what, we're helping our friend to remain quiet and on task. Or I don't know if this teacher has, tried kind of a group reinforcement system for everybody being quiet. I'm assuming they've tried praise around, but yeah, there's
earning additional time for that social interaction, so that there's planned time for that. Like you said, it goes back to what the function is of that incessant talking.
I had a student who loved to talk about Star Trek and would try to engage all these peers. And so that was kind of similar to what we did. We allowed him to accrue time dependent on, appropriate behavior, contingent on, getting his work done. And then he could just talk about Star Trek for a good 5-10 minutes with an active listener. And that was his biggest reinforcer, was just to earn that time.
Yeah, I think the important question is what does the child get out of talking all the time? It may well be peer attention. It may be adult attention. And it may be something to do that's far more interesting than the work in front of them. So until we understand that, it's really hard to design an intervention. And Katie's point about some sort of group consequences, group contingencies, where if the class meets a certain criterion for quiet, then the whole group benefits. That way you're not identifying the individual student as the problem, but everybody gets to benefit. And there's a variety of different ways of arranging group consequences that make it doable and efficient for a classroom teacher. You only have to manage essentially counting how many talkouts or something like that for the group. You don't have to figure out who did the talking out, and you're just managing one consequence. It's not individualizing by everybody in the classroom. And for the student, some students object to being singled out for intervention, so it eliminates that resistance from the student if it's for everybody.
Folks, listen, before we respond any further, I just wanted to note that the time is elapsed for our session tonight. We formally ended at 4:20, but anybody that has questions about our service, get in touch with me. And again, if you haven't listed your name, your school name or district name and your email address, do that, and we can follow back with you. If there's other questions, though, we'll take another question and field it. So if anyone else has a question out there, put it out there and we'll stay and address it. But I do want to recognize that those that need to leave are welcome to do so.
Awesome.
Ronnie, and without another question coming so far, maybe I could throw one out in that we've still got a good number of people in the room. And that is, what tends to be the more significant reason for behavior? Is it that students primarily are working to escape, or is it that they're working to get something? And maybe I'm breaking that up a little too simply. Maybe want to treat that?
No, I can tell you answer that in two different ways. For about 20 years, I ran a large public school consultation project in the Bay Area. And over that time, we did almost 800 behavioral assessments of students. And 2/3 of those assessments, the primary function of the problem behavior was to escape academic tasks. And that shouldn't be surprising when you think that the primary thing that we do in schools is give students academic tasks. And these were all students in special ed. And of course, the primary way you qualify for special education is to be behind academically. So our kids were being instructed at a level that was not appropriate to them. And so they were engaging in a variety of escape-based behaviors. If you look at the broader literature, people have summarized functions of behavior, and escape is the most common function of problem behavior when we just sum across functional assessments in schools. So it confirms my personal experience, but it's a much more systematic evidence base when we look at the research literature.
Okay. Thank you, Ronnie. And Christine, do you want to comment on that at all, based on your experience?
Well, I agree with Ronnie. I think my experience is, I don't have exact data, but I think mine is higher than 2/3. A lot of times students are in a general education classroom, maybe with getting some sped pull-out resource minutes or things like that, and they're not able to keep up with the pace or the rigor of the instruction that's being delivered in that classroom. And when kids can't, I'm a firm believer in Ross Green and his collaborative problem-solving model, and his belief that kids do well if they can. People want to be successful. And when I speak with adults that are have had problems, and some of them being in the detention centers or youth facilities, and ask them what we could do differently as teachers in their schooling systems, and they say, I wish just one person would have helped me be successful. I wish one person would have listened to me when I said, I can't do this. And they said, yes, you can. I saw you do it yesterday. That doesn't always mean that they can do it. And going back to one of the previous questions, when it was asked, how do I get the student to engage in a certain task? If they can't do it, it doesn't matter if you're offering them a Lamborghini, they can't do it. And so starting back, and I like what Ronnie said, and I agree, and I do this with the students that I work with, starting even below their instructional level at their mastery level is crucial. Those kids need to experience a level of success for a little while. I have a student that I've worked with this year, and he's in 4th grade, and he's on a 1st grade reading level, but the school didn't want to move him out of the class. He was having extremely aggressive behaviors. As soon as we pulled him out into a smaller setting and we took him back to 1st grade reading, he was so happy, and he's never in his 5 schooling years had success in reading. He's thrilled, and he's doing 2 to 3 lessons per day as opposed to 1, but he's so excited, and he's caught up with his, kind of closer to where his frustrational level is. So we're kind of trying to work between his instructional and frustrational, but he's able to do that because of all the other skills that he's learned, and because we took him back to a point where he could experience some success before it got too hard. I think that's one of the biggest things I see, is that the kids just can't do it for different reasons. And that's why it's important to have a functional behavior assessment, because even if we determine it's escape from academics, what part of that is the problem? Is it the pacing? Is it the noise in the classroom? Is it the content? Is it the writing? There's just so many facets of that to really get a good insight as to what they need, and really meeting them where they are and bringing them up to get, together, instead of pulling them and forcing them to do things that they are frustrated, at their frustrational level, or they just can't do.
And can I add to that? Because I've worked with a lot of teachers who feel the pressure to not provide, to just keep everyone kind of in the herd going. And it is absolutely okay to, you know, provide those adaptations, that curricular, you know, revision, those you know, accommodations, and, you know, messing with assignments like that. Absolutely okay to do that for one student, because they're demonstrating that they need that. And so, you know, I think often there's that pressure that's, I can't, you know, they need to kind of, you know, stick to the norm. They have to fit into this group, or, you know, but we really need to respect the individual child's needs. And yeah, when they contact that reinforcement, when they're feeling successful, you know, that will alleviate all of the challenging behavior, most likely. So.
Well, and teachers do feel a lot of pressure, I think, because they've got
Yeah.
to get this kid to a place where they can take the SAGE assessment or the RISE assessment at the end of the school year. So if they're differentiating 2 grade levels behind, how is that student going to access that end of year testing? So we kind of have a lot of variables going on there for the students as well as for the teachers. So
Absolutely.
Hey team, listen, we've still got 30 people in the room, and I'm enjoying the conversation. So I do want to pose one final question, then we will close. But I'm curious because, as many of you know that are in the room, that we are required in special education programs to provide, put students in the least restrictive environment that we can. Some people regard that as the regular ed classroom. It's a little more complicated than that, but place them out there. And yet, most of what I just heard all of you describe was that when we place them in that setting, oftentimes the kinds of supplemental aids and supports and behavior supports are not present for them to be successful in that setting. I wondered if you wanted to take that on, and that there's that legal mandate or requirement for that to be considered at least, and what we can be doing better to support primarily special or regular education teachers in their work to support these kids when they're out in that setting.
One of the first questions I always ask when we look to mainstream students is, for what purposes are we doing it? Is it because we want the child to participate in the educational, instructional activities because they have the skills to be able to accomplish, to do the work with some level of support? Or is it frankly for socialization? Because that will determine what part of the day we place the student in the mainstream setting. If you're for socialization, you don't put the student in the mainstream setting during math instruction. That you're not supposed to be socializing. We don't want those incessant talkers during math instruction. So I think that's the first question. And then the second question is, what level of accommodation do we have to make for this student to be successful in that setting? And that may require an instructional assistant essentially sitting right beside the student, modifying the task, coaching them through the task. It may be providing less invasive, intensive kinds of support, but somebody there. But again, it's almost an assessment of what level of support does the student need in order to accomplish our purposes for mainstreaming or fully including. Again, if we place a student in a setting where they're not being successful, that's a restrictive setting. We have, again, our federal mandate is the least restrictive setting in which the student can make progress. So if we're placing them in a setting where they can't make progress, then that's a restrictive setting, and we need to rethink that. We either need to alter the setting or move the child to a setting where they can experience progress. And I know a lot of folks think that it's just a good idea to either fully include or mainstream students. And I don't disagree with that, as long as we're clear on why we're doing it and how do we arrange the environment to support that purpose.
Well, and Ronnie, to jump in on something that you mentioned, you may have the kids in the general education classroom for the areas that they can access that curriculum. They have to have access to their peers. There are, things that we have to work within to ensure the students receiving free and appropriate public education. if the student's able to access the general education setting for some periods of the day or for some time of the day, but they need a more restrictive setting for other times of the day, that's something that can be worked out with your IEP teams to ensure that the student is receiving the least restrictive placement for all of the different subjects, so that they're having access to their peers, they're receiving on-level instruction, and then getting some of that tier 2 and tier 3 instruction in maybe a different setting that's that's in addition to the general education setting. So all of those minutes and services can be adjusted by that IEP team for the individual student and the individual subject, so that we make sure that they're in the least restrictive environment for each area of their day or subject of their day.
Well, folks, thank you for treating that question. And listen, again, everyone that's still in the room, there's still 28 of you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We'll go ahead and end our session now. We do hope to offer trainings like